All right. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining our fireside chat on dealing with microaggressions. I don't actually know all of you, so my name is Will Mahan. I'm the Talent Development Manager for DraftKings, and I'm based in the Boston office. My role in DraftKings is that I lead all of our soft skill and leadership development programs globally. I'm also the person who works behind the scenes on LinkedIn Learning, which is what brought us to this course in the first place. Moderating with me today is Bianca Sullivan. Bianca.
Everyone, nice to see new faces and some familiar faces. My name is Bianca Sullivan. I am an inclusion, equity, and belonging specialist here at DraftKings. For those of you who don't know me, I will talk a little bit about my role. So I work closely with our business resource groups. I also work on a lot of career role modeling opportunities and also hosting uncomfortable conversations in open discussion forums. I'm really excited to co-host or co-moderate today's LinkedIn Learning Circle with Tony. I'm really excited to have you here to provide resources to our employees around dealing with microaggressions. Before I hand the floor over to you, just wanting to do a quick intro of Tony. So Tony Lowe is a global diversity and inclusion strategist. She is the co-founder and CEO of the TCT Consulting Group and has spent years working with organizations advocating for women and underrepresented groups in the workforce. Tony, the floor is yours.
Thank you guys for having me. Super excited to be here and really just impressed that DraftKings, wanted to be a part of such a courageous conversation like microaggressions. When LinkedIn first reached out to me about becoming an author on their LinkedIn Learning platform, and then they said, what do you think about microaggressions as the first topic? I was like, oh man, you're trying to destroy me. This is a tough topic, right? So I'm excited that you guys would have me and that you're so willing and open to have a tough conversation about these types of biases and experiences in the workplace. So thank you for having me.
Thanks, Tony. And I think Bianca and I have got some questions from the group that folks have sent to us in advance of this session. Bianca, I think you have the first question.
Of course. So wanted to talk a bit about intent versus impact. Tony, in your video, you mentioned implicit bias and microaggressions essentially going hand in hand. But I think oftentimes the aggressor has very good intentions, but not really sure how their words might land with other people. Some examples could be, I'm not racist, I have Black friends, or you are really articulate. So what are some ways that victims can address these in real time without getting into an argument or feeling unsafe?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think, when we talk about like intent versus impact, it can be very subjective, right? Because someone's like, well, and I want to address this before I answer your question to Bianca, because I think I get this question a lot in my inbox. My inbox overflows. I mean, at this point, over 116,000 people have taken this course, and my inbox every day is exploding. And a lot of times the thing that people struggle with is the intent versus the impact. Well, my intention was well-intended. I didn't mean to offend. And this isn't radical stuff here. This is really about you decentering yourself and thinking about, if I ask this question in this way, how might it affect someone else, right? And so when it comes to, an offended person that is on the receiving end of a microaggression, really addressing it, the first step I would say is, how do you first clarify in setting the tone, right? So the clarifying point would be something like, help me understand what you mean by the question that you've asked, right? Just to make sure that you lead with curiosity and grace first. Like, let me make sure that I understand what you're asking me. A lot of times that gives a pathway for the person who's offending to be like, oh, wait, that wasn't my intention, like right off the bat, right? Is to do that. And if the person is so bold to say, no, like I kind of meant what I said, like this is kind of what I'm asking or what I'm curious about, The next question could be something like, well, what's the intended outcome? What are you looking to gain? What kind of knowledge? And someone might say, oh, I was curious about, where you're from or your hair or whatever that is. And you might feel comfortable enough to answer the question, but also to say, in my culture, my upbringing, and my lived experiences, I've been, really positioned to believe when you ask a question like this is kind of what it communicates to me. And I'm sure that wasn't your intention, but I just wanted you to be mindful of it, right? As you experience other people. The challenge too that I point out a lot in the video is that like addressing microaggressions is your empowered choice. So there are going to be circumstances where this isn't a one size fits all. Some people may not have the emotional capacity to help you learn, right? And that's okay too. So that would be my general answer, but I think the intent versus the impact really requires a decentering of the dominant group of themselves, right? Because ultimately, I get that question a lot, which is, but if I didn't mean to offend, is it offensive? Well, absolutely. It can still be offensive. Two things can be correct at the same time, right? And we all know that. So it does require you to have a certain amount of empathy and for you to decenter yourself and say, when I'm communicating with a non-dominant culture, do I want to do it in a way that is respectful and best serves them? And if that's not the question, that you're having in your mind, then this is always going to be radical for you and hard for you to understand if you just want to live in a world where you are allowed to say whatever you want to say without it being offended. Or offensive, I should say.
That's a great point. I think a big takeaway was having the victim really own up and kind of ask the person what your intent was to be ready to have that uncomfortable conversation. I think sometimes people may put out some points, but may not necessarily be prepared to get questioned on where that even came from, or just digging deeper into the biases that people might have.
Right.
Tony, I wanted to ask you, your course came to my consciousness because I was on LinkedIn Learning and it was featured at the top of the screen as a new course. And this was just, what, 2 or 3 months ago? The course hasn't been out that long. And no. I watched the course and immediately I messaged you on LinkedIn and I said, this is amazing. Like, please, we would love to hear from you. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting was microaggression isn't a term that was used 10 years ago, 20 years ago. It's something that's kind of new to people's consciousness. And you mentioned in the last question that over 100,000 people have watched this course just in the couple of months that it's been live. And LinkedIn Learning is a global platform. So I'm sure there's people globally who've had different lived experiences who have watched your course. There's people, as you can see, from different countries on the line now. What's been really surprising to you in the reaction and the response and the questions that you've gotten from this global audience?
Yeah, so the first point I want to make is just a clarifying point. So microaggressions, the term microaggressions were coined by Chester and Pierce in the 1970s, honestly, but it was revived by Daryl Wing over the last 10 to 15 years. And so the word has become much more popular in recent years. What has been to me most surprising is really, when I thought about doing this conversation, I really thought about it from a North American perspective, as someone who's led global companies in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I know that there are many, themes in diversity, equity, and inclusion that really are more North American concepts. And so I thought this would be overwhelmingly only a large US audience, right? But as soon as it dropped, I got emails from China, from Poland, and it was amazing. I think that if you watch it, I was pretty thoughtful about sharing experiences and definitions that were rooted in that may have addressed maybe racial or ethnic experiences from an offensive perspective, but not necessarily from the offender. And that was very intentional because I knew that culturally examples would reach a larger audience if we could talk about it from a large holistic view. So I've been super surprised to see that it has been so popular internationally. And that wasn't what I expected. And for people to come in my inbox, sometimes write me 2-page letters about their experiences in other countries. And I do read them all. I try. It's getting a little overwhelming at this point, but I do try to read them all. And I've been super surprised to see how this has resonated with so many people, which also validates that this conversation courageously needed to happen across the world.
Mm. When you receive those responses, do you find that they're pretty much like the same questions that you get from global audiences? Are there nuances between the questions you get from folks in North America versus other parts of the world? Or is it one of those cases where it's more similar than we think?
I think we're definitely more similar than we think. I think, in North America, we think about it racially very black and white, right? In terms of these experiences. Globally, it really is about the dominant culture or the dominant culture of influence in terms of expectations that really determine really who has the power and the influence to say and or offend. And it's really very similar in the dynamic. What I will say that in terms of the questions that I get is that typically the dominant culture is struggling with the offense, right? And again, that intent versus impact, and really wanting to dissect with me, if everyone is biased, then how aren't we all experiencing something? And then there's a question or a conversation around power dynamics, and understanding that that dominant cultures, dominant groups do have discretionary power, right? And they can determine with the benefit of there not being as much risk. And so it's not a radical concept, but you have to be willing and open to kind of walk through decentering yourself a bit to understand how something might be offensive to a non-dominant culture that is consistently marginalized in some way.
I think I want to kind of chime in here on the conversation about global inclusion. And I think that for a lot of us, we are on global teams, and within those dynamics, we see that maybe there's one person in particular that doesn't talk at all in meetings. They just may not feel empowered to speak up. And I know in your video, you mentioned the importance of psychological safety and how important it is to help enhance team performances. So are there any tips that you can give to managers on how to create a safe space for people of all communities to want to engage and or share experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think, creating psychological safety is really about the team understanding that there's no interpersonal risk and that everybody is like respected and safe in an environment to fully be themselves or to bring about, feedback and those things. I think it's about really being aware of the dynamics, both, whether that's racially, ethnically, culturally, and being respectful of that, right? There might be some cultures where, the hierarchy of leadership is seen differently, right? And so it's respectful to be more quiet or to speak when asked to be, so to tell someone, they're not vocal enough, it might be particularly not respectful in their culture. So you're asking them to do something outside of what their experience is. And so those are the kind of things to understand that your team has very lived experiences and to respect those. In a gender situation, if you see that, the dominant, maybe male professionals in your group tend to talk over women, for example, you might stop and say, hey, Tony, Bianca, were you saying something? I want to make sure that your point is heard. So I think it is you lead from the front, right? And you demonstrate the behavior that you want everyone to model. Is probably the feedback that I could think is the most important to me in my head around how you create psychological safety. In teams, really the leader sets the tone for what will and won't be tolerated. I believe.
Would you happen to have like any resources for people looking to learn more about psychological safety and or ways they can show up for their teams?
Yeah, that psychological safety was coined by Dr. Amy Edmondson. Edmondson. I want to make sure I pronounce all the syllables in her name. So I think if you really just Google her, she has a lot of amazing content around psychological safety, and you can find tons of. She has a book. There's all kinds of things. So would encourage people to dig in there.
Thank you.
Tony, I wanted to ask, one of the most surprising parts of your course for me was there is a statistic that you cited where you said only 26% of employees say that they've experienced some sort of microaggression in the workplace. And as I was watching your course, some of the examples you gave, I just felt like, of course, we've all heard this. We've all I totally expected that number to be far higher than 26%. I'm curious to know if you think that number is a true number, or if perhaps the other 74% of the respondents who didn't agree, maybe microaggressions can be so subtle. It's something that maybe goes unnoticed at times. I was curious to know what your thoughts were on that statistic.
I honestly think that people don't understand the concept of microaggression. They know that they feel that they've been offended. They know that they feel maybe ostracized or treated differently, but they don't really have the words for it. The number one thing in my inbox has been from marginalized groups telling me thank you for validating their experiences, sending me notes saying, if I had had this a year ago, 3 weeks ago, 5 years ago, I would have been better equipped in a particular situation, a company. So to me, I think what was so necessary and why, I'll just be honest with you, for first time authors on LinkedIn Learning, the average of learners is around 8 to 10,000 in the 60-day mark. That's about how many learners are taking your course. I think as of yesterday, my course is at 116,000 learners in 60 days. So I think I don't give myself the credit as being just, so amazing per se. I think this is a conversation that and an interest that people were and an experience that people were having that had not been discussed before, right? And I think that's why it's so popular. I think it resonates so much, and it stirs up a level of tension. There have been a lot of people have asked me, have I looked on the comment section on the main course page? And I was like, nope, I really don't go down the rabbit hole because here's the thing. They're also, I don't want to paint this as all like rose colored glasses and the sky is blue. There are people who are really, really upset about this course because they just don't believe in the concepts, right? And they're like, this is just malarkey. It's not true. And so you can kind of go down that rabbit hole. What I love is that it's such a great conversation to be had that it's sort of policing itself, so to speak. So there are people who I don't really have to respond as the author because that's the beauty about having a courageous conversation, is that it just naturally happens when it needs to happen. So there are so many people who are defending it and sharing their experiences, which is wonderful to see.
You may have not gone in your comment section, but I have gone in your comment section. And it is so interesting to see some of the debate and discussion that's happening on a LinkedIn Learning comment board. It's been really interesting. And to maybe take it a step further, you made the point that, you know, microaggressions is becoming something that's a bit more conscious, you know, in the last few years. In your course, I had never heard of the terms microassault and microinvalidations, and for me, that was one of those sections in your course that I actually watched it multiple times. I wanted to watch it again, and I thought it was so interesting. Specifically, the piece about microinvalidations. I think we've all heard somebody say things like, "I don't see color," or, you know, "Things are so much better now than they were then. Like, we're making progress." I would love if you can, you know, those are probably new terms for a lot of people on the line who may have just watched your course. I'd love if you can talk a little bit about microassault and microinvalidation.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to be honest with you, even as I start to deep dive into the content, I was just, and you can tell from how I created the course, how involved I was in the details, because I was just, every time I would discover new things, I'm like, oh, this is so good, you know? And, you know, when it comes to micro assault, I don't even think I had the language as someone who really has been doing this work for years. You know, there were so many things even I discovered that I'm like, man, what an amazing word, right? So micro assaults are really things that are really more outwardly shown. For example, like if you see someone and they have like a swastika tattooed on them, or you know, what could be something as simple as like Make America Great Again, red hat, or Confederate flag, you're not necessarily saying that I, you know, align, or there's not an act where you might say, you know, I align to this sort of ideology, but it's a denigrating message to marginalized groups where those symbols may have triggers and wounds, right? So you're telling me, you're communicating through those actions a real assault, right? How uncomfortable would it be for me to sit next to someone who has that hat on or has a Confederate flag? Now, again, a large part of this, you know, you have people who are arguing in those comments because if you consider yourself a nationalist or a patriot, patriotism, you're like, that is not what that means. But if you're journeying, you understand that those symbols mean something different and send a different message that's denigrating to marginalized communities, right? So that's kind of the assault piece. Microinvalidation, you know, is a little bit different, right? It is, you know, that racism doesn't exist. It's the pushing down of lived experiences to invalidate how you're feeling differently, right? And I can recall being really young and feeling like just simple things, like, for example, and this is like the funniest story. I was in a Girl Scout troop and I was the only brown girl in the Girl Scout troop. I was probably a daisy, so I was probably like 7. And we're on a global platform, so Girl Scouts of America is like, you know, sort of a youth group. And we played a game where everybody brought their baby pictures, right? And the person who people didn't guess the most won like this big prize. Very small thing, but even from a young age, I thought, well, this is pretty unfair, right? And so it is, in many ways, it's an invalidating of like the dominant culture is the center. And so the invalidating comes from not honoring your lived experiences of being different. So to say to someone, I don't see color. And it's just like, I'm really proud of my color, right? I'm really proud of my culture. And I want you to see the fullness of that. You know, one could argue, well, like, well, you know, I'm colorblind and, you know, all these things, right? You know, and what we really want people to do is be color brave and to be able to see the fullness of everyone.
Thank you. Bianca, I think we've got time for one more question before we open it up to the full group here.
All right, I have a couple, but I will minimize it to one. But something that we talk about a lot at DraftKings is allyship. And I wanted to ask you maybe for some tangible tips on how allies can redirect bad behavior, whether that's in a meeting or maybe through Slack. But what are some ways that they can intervene?
Yeah, I mean, I think that silence is an action, right? So when it comes to recognizing microaggressions or offenses, it's important for people who are in a dominant culture or a more advantaged position, because that could be different too, because you could both be from marginalized groups, but in the scenario, I could be in a more advantaged position. So I want to call that out. Is to make sure that there's always cover, and again, that we're always modeling inclusive behaviors by protecting. So I gave an example earlier, and I'll re-give it, which is that, like, if someone is speaking and then someone cuts them off, and you feel like this is because they're in the dominant culture, or there's not, you could say, hey, Bianca, were you speaking? I want to make sure that we heard your point. I don't want you to be cut off. And you can simply, it's very, very, very small things like that I think could add cover. Allyship, though, also requires, going back to our earlier points around psychological safety. What sometimes happens too, and I think I gave this in the Big Dave example, is that it is important for you to create psychological safety, because if you call yourself defending me and you do it in a way that causes a lot of attention or tension to a situation, you're speaking for me and not for yourself, right? So there's a difference between you offended Tony. You should not have said it. You've not had a conversation with me about it. And now you've put me on the spot, as opposed to you saying, what you just said, I'm not sure if it offends Tony, but it certainly offended me. Take credit for the offense, because it could actually put the marginalized person in a worse off position by you calling attention to it. So I think allyship is about, one, modeling behaviors, and then secondly, creating psychological safety.
Awesome answer, thank you. I think with that, we can segue to our Q&A section. Will, do you want to go through the comments and look for any questions?
Sure. I know a lot of folks have sent Bianca and I questions in advance, but we're all here. You're on camera. You've got Tony in front of you, so feel free, if anybody's brave, take yourself off mute and let's just engage in a group discussion. It's always hardest to be the first person.
I'll kick us off here. I'll try to be brave here.
All right.
So first, Tony, this was excellent. I appreciate kind of building off of the great learning course that we looked at beforehand. I think a reoccurring theme, and one I'm trying to be more self-conscious and aware of is decentering myself in conversations. So you brought up some great ideas of starting with your intent of a question or a comment. What's your overall intent? And then maybe rethinking through, if someone were to ask me the same thing or trying to get to the same goal, what are different ways I can ask this? So big topic for me, just to self-reflect of how do I get more conscious and look from the outside in before asking or saying something that has good intent, but maybe interpreted differently. Are there any other tactics that you would build upon that outside of self-reflection, or maybe asking the question to yourself first to make sure that you're being as conscious and as respectful as possible to the person that you have good intent with?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Okay, so you stumped me. So there's so many, because that's such a broad question in a way, but also such a niche question at the same time, because it's really a scenario by scenario perspective. I'm trying to think of a really good scenario to provide you. Oh, something popped in my head. So for example, and this actually came into my LinkedIn box, right? Someone said to me, what I was really stuck on, right? Someone from a dominant culture said, what I was really stuck on was this scenario around telling someone that they speak well, right? I see that all over the internet and I don't understand. Like, what if you really are a good speaker, right? And I asked him to step back and think, how often does he hear? We'll talk about from an American perspective, dominant culture, a white cisgender male being complimented on how they speak unless they actually are an amazing orator, right? Right. So when I think about giving a compliment around speaking, I'm not offended if someone says, "Oh, Tony, man, you're amazing, captivating orator. You speak really well in terms of, how you captivate an audience," right? You think about amazing speakers in the world, John Maxwell or Martin Luther King, they speak really well. But to be given a compliment when you're from a marginalized group, when you are speaking like your peers, right? I don't particularly love to speak in front of groups. I don't speak any differently from anyone else. The denigrating message that it sends is either you don't believe that I should be as good in English or whatever the dominant language is because of where you perceive I'm from, or where you perceive I grew up, or whatever my experiences are. So I think going back to that decentering of ourselves, it is another question you can ask yourself is, would I ask this question to a dominant group? Would I give this feedback or this compliment to a dominant group? Because just because you believe that this is a compliment does not mean that it's a compliment, right? Another example is I can remember a time in my career where we were preparing for this really big meeting for our board, and a very high leader told me, "You know what I would really like is if, you know how when you wear your hair really straight, it was so nice," right? What he was communicating to me was that in my natural state, the fullness of who I am, my hair in its natural state is like a coil, that he would prefer that I wear my hair straight, right? Which resonates with the dominant culture, right? Was it mean the way he said it? No, right? Was it, did he yell at me? Did he require that I do it? No, but what he was saying based on his level and position is that that would be more palpable for him and more comfortable for everyone else. And that is something that we have to think about, right? Is would we require this of the dominant culture? And is the dominant culture the standard for what professionalism or success or whatever that is, so that would be my answer, right? Is to continue to, my favorite thing to challenge people on is to ask, how are you participating?
Kurt, way to start off the Q&A on a high note.
Thank you. That was awesome, Tony. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Tony.
No, thank you for the question.
Yeah. Opening it up to the group, other questions that you have for Tony? Jason, I saw you take yourself off mute there.
Yeah, actually, I do have a question. So you covered a little bit about when the person's in the room in your course and not like jumping on them and creating a problem. What if you see a microaggression and the person's not in the room? Like a good example that happened to me was, oh, it sucks that I'm in a room of guys. Oh, it sucks that Karen's not here. She takes really good notes. What's the best way to handle that sort of situation? I mean, should I call it out right there on the spot because the person's not here? And what's the best way to do that and not just like a lot of times people will just immediately pile on you, in a very negative way when you do that.
Yeah. I think one of the things that happens when we're offended is that we feel like addressing a concern has to be contentious, right? But I believe in like a lot of tongue-in-cheek, kind of responses, and to point out and to help people sit with, the statement that they said, right? And so I think, for one, it is actually, in my opinion, much easier in a homogenous group to address a concern with the person who is, being offended not being present, right? And I think just giving feedback head on, like, well, it's a good thing that we all have note-taking skills and we're not just relying on women to take notes, right? Like, I mean, you can just really be tongue-in-cheek about it and kind of be funny and say, but on a serious note, I think we want to make sure that we're not sending the message that the only, I think she's very talented. She contributes a lot, but note taking is not the only thing that she can do. And certainly we can survive taking notes because we're all skilled professionals. And you just kind of move on, right? I think that it doesn't have to be contentious. You don't have to be like, that's sexist. You don't have to scream it. You really can just, again, model. And I think when it comes to application of learning and evolving in a journey, it is much more palpable for people when they receive it in a way where they can sit with it and think about, man, that didn't feel really great. Maybe I have an opportunity there, right? When you tend to kind of like pound the floor on people, then it becomes a fight about who's right and what again, you start arguing about intent, right? And not the impact. So that would be my answer. Hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you.
Tony, I'd like to play devil's advocate a little bit there in response to your scenario and Jason's question. So suppose he talks up about that in a group setting and someone replies and says, I feel like I'm walking on eggshells or my language is being policed. How would he then respond to that person?
Yeah. I think what he should say, well, I don't feel like my language is being policed. So let's start at a starting point, right? If your language is being policed, why is that, right? Let's talk about some of the feedback you've been getting on some of the things that you've been saying, right? If that is not the experience of everyone, right? Now, if everyone's language feels like it's being policed, then maybe we have a hypersensitive culture and we need to talk about it. But I would guarantee that the people who give the feedback are people who are not trying to decenter themselves, who feel as a dominant culture, they should be allowed to say whatever, no matter how it lands or how it offends, right? And so I think part of that is let's sit down and talk about what is some of the feedback that you've gotten. Why do you feel that way? And to say, I don't feel that way. I feel, I haven't gotten the same feedback. So what about our experiences are different? I love to come from curiosity and help people walk themselves through what might be problematic about their delivery, as opposed to telling them they're wrong.
Thank you.
I have a quick question. I just thought of it, so hopefully I can formulate this properly. But in your opinion, do you believe that communication since the pandemic has started creates more space on Slack or on Zoom for microaggressions, or do you think it minimizes it? Because I find in Slack, a lot of teams can just kind of communicate just what they need and not really create any room for extra comments or things like that. But I am curious to see if people have found that it's creating more room or less. So,
I mean, obviously, I think interpersonal, in-person relationships leave room. It's actually a double-sided, six in one hand, half a dozen in the other, honestly, because in one regard, I would say that the more you interact in person in interpersonal relationships, the more there's room for those types of interactions to happen. In the other respect, on the flip side of it, I also think that it could happen in both ways in some respects too, because or if you are an offender, you get far and far less proximate relationships to improve, right? So I mean, I think it could be a lot of different things. I don't know that I'm seeing. I think particularly for the U.S., and I won't even say the U.S., I think globally there has really been a reckoning. And so we're seeing more things of contention around race relations and things of that nature. To answer your question about the flip side, also I find that people are much more courageous behind a computer and feedback and their feelings than they would be in person, right? I would say that half the people who write probably bad things on the core page would probably see me and be very pleasant in person. Very few people would say the things that they say online that they would in person. So it's a little bit of both. I don't know that that's helpful for you, but I think it's a little bit of both. And also too, I think it has a lot to do with what's going on in the world too, which has always been really going on in the world, but what has been obviously more apparent to the more dominant cultures of recent.
Great. Yeah, that was very helpful. As a project manager, I always just want to make sure if it makes more sense to bring people together over Zoom to have conversations or on Slack, and what would create a more like a safer space for everyone. So thank you.
Yeah. But I think that, you know what, another thing that resonates for me though, is that being remote, the dominant culture in a remote situation might be someone who doesn't have a family life, or I won't say family life, doesn't have, isn't a caregiver, so to speak. And so sometimes the way in which we expect things or communicate things to someone who might be overwhelmed by the fact that they are also, being a homeschool parent, or, caring for an elderly parent might be different. So there are many ways that, there can be dominant and non-dominant behavior that could be, a bit of a microaggression. You typically see it obviously more in the traditional sense, but this behavior can resonate in any scenario where one particular group has more influence or power or capacity based on what the scenario is.
Hi.
Hi.
I remember you speaking about micro assaults and micro invalidations, but I wanted to get your opinion on something called micro concessions.
Okay.
Basically just kind of like, oh yeah, your people are oppressed, but we got rid of Aunt Jemima, and
Yeah.
just kind of like taking a lot, like using something small, or depending on how you look at it, but using something that's not a huge fix, but something that is a fix, but using that to take attention away from, the more important issues and the things that, we're really trying to work on. But I wanted to get like just your opinion on that, and like how to kind of navigate that type of feeling when you see something like that and you just like kind of roll your eyes, or if somebody even mentions it, or like, like you're talking about racism and they're like, oh, well, they got, Uncle Ben's not a thing anymore, or, the Washington.
President Obama, you got President Obama, all the world's issues are solved. Yeah, right. I mean, 100 concessions. Yeah, I 100% agree. I think it goes back to the same feedback that I gave before, which is like really getting to the root of like, that's an interesting question. What makes you feel that way, right? Because half the time I think there are times where people are very unconscious about what they're saying, but there are times where microaggressions are subtly meant to be offensive, right? And so I think in scenarios like that, when you call people or charge people to explain the intent behind that, right? Now, sometimes people are really aloof. They're like, well, I really think that we've had progress, right? And sometimes you can have an amazing dialogue, right? And so when we start talking about systemic racism, we're like, you do realize that it is a full system, right? And so we can talk about the many things that still exist today, and then also like a really quick civic lesson on what power a president has in the US, right? Which is not to solve everything and cannot be solved by a president. And so for me, I think oftentimes it does, it really depends on, do you have the capacity to bring someone along and to have a conversation that's going to elevate their thinking, right? I have like a laundry list of books, right? One of the books that I love whenever someone hits me with like a micro concession is The Colors of Law. Here's my challenge to you. First, I'm going to challenge you on to clarify the point. What are you after? And then instead of arguing with you about my lived experience or what it is, I'm like, would you do something? Would you be willing to do something with me? Would you be willing to read The Colors of Law? There's also like an 18-minute video called Segregated by Design, just in case their capacity is like I don't read books. There's a small video, it's about 18 minutes called, and it's kind of a video companion to the book called Segregated by Design. And I'll say, if you'd be willing to read that book, or if you'd be willing to watch that movie, let's set up some time and have a conversation afterwards about how you feel. Again, I do this work, so I don't take it lightly that I have not only the capacity, but the skill to talk through with people. But the biggest thing that I would say is stay out of the fight of blame and forcing people to understand your experiences, and get them to the root of decentering themselves so that they can have empathy for your lived experience. I'm not going to argue with you because you haven't walked in my shoes. You're not going to understand what it's like to be a Black female. But what I can do is to challenge your thinking, right? To decenter yourself and to think, what if what you said might not be true? What if the concession you've given yourself is merely to believe that that is true as a dominant culture, to really reprieve yourself of the responsibility of how you participate? What if that's the question? And I think that requires you to make sure you have not only the emotional capacity, but also are not angered by or triggered by the lack of knowledge, but want to equip people with a different way of thinking. And everyone is not equipped to do that work, but that would be my feedback.
Love it. Love it. Thank you.
Kia, I saw you take yourself off mute there for a second. Did you have a question also?
Yes, I did. Thanks, Will.
Yeah.
Tony, I wanted to get back to the conversation a little bit about hair. In that situation, how did you respond? Because obviously, as a woman of color, we change our hair a lot. And for some reason, it's very interesting for a lot of people, and they have a lot of questions. And when I get uncomfortable or nervous, I kind of just laugh. So what recommendations do you have for not only like a coworker, but maybe a superior who's asking you uncomfortable questions about your hair?
So, I basically just responded and said, I appreciated, that you like my hair, but your preference is really not a deciding factor for how I'm going to wear my hair. And then I wore it in like the biggest curly afro with like a band for the meeting. And then I rocked it. I killed the meeting. And here's the thing about that type of kind of brazen behavior, so to speak, is that I have traded in and understand the risk of not conforming to dominant culture. And it's a risk that I take daily, right?
Yes.
That is not a risk that everyone is going to be willing to take, right? But what I find and what I have personally found is that when I ask myself, how am I participating? It was in playing it small to lean into the dominant culture and standard. And when I showed up for myself, people adjusted. So his merely saying that his preference, my hair being straight, was his preference and what he liked, honestly didn't change a thing about our relationship and what I brought to the table as an executive leader in that role, and how he felt about the work that I delivered on, right? Would he prefer for me to have wear my hair straight? Yeah, but it was just a preference, and I could either give power to that or not. But I am not lost on the thought that in every scenario that's not going to be the case, and that there is some sort of risk in challenging things that are seen, and you see even for hair, particularly for Black women, you see the Crown Act, and you see that there have been many challenges around hair and what is the standard of professionalism, which is very Eurocentric in terms of what we should look like. one of the ways that I'm now showing up as a leader is like, today I have my hair braided, right? There was a time 10, 15 years ago where I was like, oh my gosh, I got to rush to take these braids out and press my hair straight because I need to look a certain way. But that was a conscious decision that I made in terms of how I was participating. And I can't ask you to evolve your thinking if I'm leaning in to the stereotype and the bias in order, which also forces other women who look like me to have to conform if I'm at a higher level, right? That's the conversation that I had to have with myself. And so, and honestly, to be honest with you, what kind of freed me was an executive leader who looked like me, who I had a lot of respect, who wore her hair like straight and like she was meticulous. And one day she just like buzz cut her hair and came to work. And I was like, and she rocked it. She looked amazing. And I think she opened the door for us to be able to show up as our full self, right? And so I kind of live by that as well. That's my own allyship within my own marginalized community, right? So I don't know if that answers the question, but what I'll say is that I basically just very tongue-in-cheek told him like, well, I appreciate that you like my hair straight, but your preferences, it really will depend on how I feel when I wake up that morning and how I manage my hair, like your preferences don't really, and then I said something kind of funny, like, as I'm sure, I really like when you wear that blue blazer, but I'm sure that's not necessarily what you're gonna wear that day. And he started like, oh, I didn't mean it that way. I'm sorry. I just really like and then I didn't wear my hair that way, which also taught him like, I might have naturally worn my hair straight, which also taught him like that was not an appropriate comment for me, which he never said it again. So I think that is, again, you teach through dialogue, not necessarily anger.
Right. Thank you.
Tony, last question that we've got for you. Somehow an hour has flown by almost.
I know.
Yeah. The last question that I've got for you is, your course started really simply by saying we all have bias. I think this conversation started with that same statement. And as I was watching your course, of course, and I'm sure a lot of people online looked inward, and I was thinking to myself, am I guilty of any of these things? And the one thing that jumped out to me personally the most was that there's a piece where you referenced sexist and heterosexist language. And I thought to myself, how many times have I started a meeting or a training by saying, hi guys, welcome to our fireside chat. And it's not guys, it's a mixed audience, right? And so I thought to myself, we're all guilty of some of these things. What is your advice for all of us on this line to hold ourselves more accountable? I'm a big believer in the idea that when you know better, you do better. And so what are some tips that you can share with the group so that we can all do better after this session?
Yeah, I mean, it's a simple call to action. I've said it several times on this call, but it's the constant question of how am I participating? The root of leaning into dominant culture and of not being inclusive is by asking yourself, how am I participating? And even as a marginalized group, you can be participating, right? You can be participating through your conformity, through your silence. And I think it's about all of us making a conscious decision that we all have to come along, and we have to ensure that just because our intentions are well-intended doesn't mean that they are safe. And if we're asking ourselves through our language and how we do, we're all responsible. Here's the thing, I do this work. I literally have a whole course on microaggressions, and still I get things wrong, right? There are times where, I have some I could be talking about, like, for example, the LGBTQ+ community, and I'll get a term or a pronoun wrong, and someone will walk up to me. I'm not offended by it. I want people to be safe. I want them to be represented the best way that they would like to be represented. So if I get it wrong, I just get it right the next time, right? So my encouragement would be to, one, ask yourself how you're participating, and to make a commitment to always get it right the next time.
Appreciate it. Bianca, I think we're gonna close this out.
Well, thank you so much, Tony, for sharing your expertise around dealing with microaggressions. I think you gave us a lot of action steps for victims, aggressors, and allies to address microaggressions in real time. If you haven't already, we really encourage you to watch Tony's LinkedIn learning video. Bella, definitely put that in the chat. For additional conversations, please join our business resource group Slack channels. That's also listed in the chat. For everyone, we still have a lot of work to do, but attending today's LinkedIn Learning Circle was definitely the first step in the right direction. I hope you have a wonderful morning, day, and afternoon.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you guys for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.